Well, tucked away in the back of the New Testament is one of the most notable books of the Bible. It's the book of James. And James is only 5 chapters, but it is such a significant biblical writing. And there are 3 reasons that James is so notable. One, it almost certainly was written by the brother of Jesus. And think about that. If a book was written by the brother of Jesus, that's pretty special, isn't it? And if it was written by the brother of Jesus, then it most likely is one of the earliest writings we have in the New Testament, probably written around 60 A.D. But more importantly, the book of James is notable because it is considered to be the premier book of practical Christian living. When you look at all the Bible, Christian thinkers believe that the book of James is the premier book of practical Christian living, how we live our lives day by day in faithfulness to God's call. And so we're going to spend 3 Sundays with the book of James. And you'll find on the inside flap of your bulletin this morning the 4 particular passages that I'm going to look at in chapter 1. 4 particular truths around those passages found in your bulletin from the book of James. First of all, this: learn to see the good in adversity. James tells us to learn to see the good in adversity. He writes, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds." Now, that really sounds, if you think about it, spiritually incredulous. Consider it pure joy when you face challenge and difficulty and heartache and heartbreak in your life. Consider it pure joy. The floodwaters take away everything I own, and I'm supposed to consider that pure joy? My loved one is diagnosed with cancer, and I'm supposed to consider that pure joy? My husband loses his job, and we find ourselves under strong economic constraint, and I'm supposed to consider that pure joy? My loved one is battling depression, a mental health condition, and I'm supposed to just consider that pure joy? Our family is fractured and falling apart, and I'm supposed to consider that with pure joy? Surely God doesn't expect us to look at all the heartaches and the heartbreak and the difficulties of life with pure joy. The key to what James means comes in verse 3 when he writes, "You know the testing of your faith produces endurance." You know the testing of your faith produces endurance. James isn't saying that we just cheer loudly when the difficulties come our way in life, but he is saying this: that without those difficulties, you will not grow, you will not develop, you will not mature. Without adversity in our lives, we will not grow, we will not develop, and we will not mature. I've been a pastor, as you know by now, over 40 years. And I'm not sure that I've ever met anyone in my pastoral ministry who hasn't said to me at one time or another, after they've gone through a great crisis, I'm a better person for it. In looking in on the wildfires that are occurring in Southern California, I was reminded of a great tragedy that occurred 3 years ago, and you'll remember this, on Yarnell Mountain in Yarnell, Arizona. 3 years ago, there were wildfires just like we're finding spreading across Southern California. And they flew in firefighters, special firefighters from all over the country. And among those who were flown in were 19 members of the Granite Mountain Hot Shots. And they were on Yarnell Mountain. And they were fighting the fire. And suddenly the wind changed the direction of the flames they were fighting. And they were caught in a canyon. And 2,000-degree flames swept over them. And in spite of their shelters, in spite of their fire-resistant clothing, 19 members of the Granite Mountain Hot Shots died on that day. Remember that? 3 years ago, Yarnell, Arizona, Yarnell Mountain, Granite Hot Shots flown in to fight that fire. They're caught in a canyon. the flames 2,000 degrees sweep over them, and they're all killed. Among those who died that day was a young man named Andrew Ashcroft. Andrew Ashcroft was 29 years old, married to Julianne. He had 4 children, ages 5, 3, 2, and a newborn. Isn't that? 5, 3, 2, and a newborn. They lost their father on Yarnell Mountain. And Julianne lost her beloved husband that day 3 years ago on Yarnell Mountain. A year after the death of her husband, Julianne was interviewed by a reporter as to what the year had been like. Pay careful attention. This is a woman who lost her husband, who's had to become the sole parent to children 5, 4, 5, 3, 2, and newborn. And here's what she says a year after that tragedy. Pay attention. There have been, even amidst our deep grief and pain, huge blessings that come through all of this. We have met some wonderful, caring, supportive people. As far as my children, they're good. They're so resilient. They give me strength. There are still some effects of grief, but we're working through them. Christmas, birthdays, that kind of thing. But I believe they'll use what happened to build strength in themselves. It's a huge lesson. In a way, it took Andrew dying for us to learn how to live. My kids and I know that every day is precious. Hopefully, they'll go through life appreciating that. With God's help, we survived that first day after Andrew died, and we have survived every day after that for a year, 365 days. We can do them again and again and again and again. James isn't saying that you and I celebrate the difficulties and the heartache and the heartbreak and the great challenges of life, but James is saying to you and to me that we cannot grow and mature and become all that God wants us to be without adversity. If you want your life to be free of adversity, then give up spiritual growth. Because one of the primary ways we grow, James says, if we'll let it, is by adversity. Second thing James says, seek God's wisdom in life. If any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, and it will be given to you. Now, you know what we're asking for when we ask for God's wisdom, don't you? We're asking for divine wisdom. We're asking for wisdom beyond our own wisdom. We're asking that we have wisdom for decisions in life that we won't have without God's help. We're asking for wisdom to walk a certain direction that we couldn't walk or wouldn't know to walk without God's help. We're asking for wisdom for the right pathway in life that we wouldn't know if we didn't seek God's help. To truly seek God's wisdom, as James speaks, is to seek that divine wisdom which is beyond our wisdom and without which we cannot make the right decisions, cannot go in the right direction, cannot follow the right path, right? Now here's the key. When you pray for God's wisdom, you need to understand, and I need to understand what we're doing. We're asking for His desire, His will, and His choice. Not ours. Because, friends, I'm going to be honest. I think far too often when we say, I'm praying for God's wisdom, what we're really praying is that God will okay the decision we've already made. Far too often when you and I pray for God's wisdom, what we're really doing is asking Him to affirm the direction we've already taken. Far too often when we say, I'm praying for God's wisdom in this particular situation, what we're really praying for is confirmation that the path I'm already walking, God will feel good about. Listen to me very carefully. When you pray for God's wisdom, and when I pray for God's wisdom, we give up, listen very carefully, we give up the privilege of our wisdom being primary. And we give it over to God. And whenever we give it over to God, what's the best wisdom? His will, His choice, His desire. Third thing from James. Be careful the place of material possessions in your life. And this is relevant for us moderns in particular. Be careful the place of material possessions in your life. He writes, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Ouch. That's tough stuff. The rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Now, on the surface, it sounds like that James is saying, if you're wealthy, if you have more resources than you need, if you're prosperous, if you're successful, oh, good luck, you're doomed. He can't mean that. And the reason he can't mean that is because nowhere in the Bible does the Bible categorically condemn wealth or prosperity or success. And no time did Jesus himself ever condemn categorically wealth and prosperity and success. Ever. But here's what James meant. If we're not careful, insidiously, our desire for the newest and the brightest and the best and the biggest takes root in our souls. And James' lesson to you and to me, us moderns, is that when we let material possessions get on the throne of our heart, and nobody here says, hey, I want material possessions to be on the throne of my heart, we're fooling ourselves if we don't believe it can insidiously happen. I got to have the newest. I got to have the biggest. I got to have the brightest. I got to have the best. And when it settles into the throne of your heart, then your spiritual vitality fades. Like a plant that under the scorching heat withers. So letting material possessions take root in our souls withers our souls. That's why Jesus said this. You cannot worship two gods at once. You can't worship God and money. Or more pointedly, watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in abundance of possessions. Insidiously, unintentionally, material possessions can take root in our lives and on the throne of our heart. Someone has said there are three questions we all ought to ask ourselves if we want to avoid that. The first one is, am I being seduced by materialism? Are you? Am I? Are you seeking to be generous with your prosperity? And let's don't fool ourselves, folks. There's not anyone in this sanctuary who's not prosperous. None of us. We may not be wealthy, but we're prosperous. Why? Because every one of us in this sanctuary, Richard Smith included, has more than we need. And I don't think anybody here would disagree with that. Am I being generous with my prosperity? And the third question, am I looking for ways to help the disadvantaged? That's how you avoid materialism taking the soul. And the final thing, James says, learn to handle temptation. He writes, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. But each person is tempted when he or she is dragged away by our own craving or our own desire. I've mentioned before the name Will Willimon. He's a retired bishop of the United Methodist Church. He's now teaching Duke Divinity School. He tells about the occasion when he was teaching a Bible study, a women's Bible study in an upper scale church, and made up mainly of upper middle-aged women and older women. Again, it just happened to be women. Could have happened to us men. And he's teaching on temptation. And in this Bible study came a young woman who had not been there before. So he's at this church. He's familiar with the church, upper scale church, upper middle-aged women, older women. And a young woman comes to the Bible study who's clearly out of sync with that group. One, she's young. Two, she is materially different because of the clothes she wears. She's not one of them. And during the lesson, Bishop Willimon asked this question: have any of you ever been faced with temptation and with Jesus' help resisted? And immediately the young woman shoots up her hand and bears this testimony. A couple of years ago, I was into cocaine really big. You know what that's like. Now, keep in mind, this is an upper middle-aged group and older women in an upper-scale church. You know how that stuff makes you crazy. My boyfriend and I decided to rob a gas station. It was as simple as taking candy from a baby. Now, she's sharing this in this Bible study. That night, my boyfriend also wanted to rob a convenience store, but something inside me told me I shouldn't do that. My boyfriend was so mad he beat me up. But I felt good because that was the only time in my life that I ever said no to anything. And Bishop Willimon writes that when that young woman stood up and gave that testimony, there was absolute silence in the group, as you might imagine. He stammered for the right words. And then he summed it up by saying this: she hit the nail on the head. We're all tempted. Can we, with God's help, learn to say no? I'm sure this is not your testimony, and it's not my testimony. But there's not a one of us in this sanctuary this morning who would ever dare say that we're not battling temptation. Would you? It's not that. But it can be the desire to get even with somebody. It can be the lure of an illicit relationship. It can be the tendency to put your needs above everybody else's. It can be the aspiration to get to the top no matter what you have to do. It can be the willingness to let anger stew and brew toward people who disagree with you or disappoint you. It can be the inclination to gossip about others and be judgmental. It can be the pull toward arrogance. I'm so much better than everybody else. It can be the attitude that we deserve our blessings, and on the list go. You could complete that list. Here's what James is saying. Don't blame anybody. Don't blame anybody. When the cravings and the desires and the temptation aren't resisted. Because like that young woman, every one of us with God's help can say no to temptation. Every one of us. I just love this book. My guess is you've studied the book of James. We're going to continue to study it. But today, the lessons are, learn to see the good in adversity. Without it, we cannot grow spiritually. Truly seek God's wisdom, His will, His choice, His desire. Be careful the pull of material things. They will deplete your soul. And handle temptation with God's help. Let us stand and affirm our faith in song.